They had dressed her in the wrong color. Maisie noticed it the moment her stepmother's fingers finished fastening the last button at the back of her neck. Ivory, not white, a shade chosen specifically because it would make her complexion look sallow beneath the council hall's torchlight. She said nothing. She had learned, a long time ago, that noticing things aloud only made them worse. "Stand straight," Corinna said, stepping back to examine her with the detached precision of a woman appraising livestock. Her stepmother's gown was deep crimson, fitted perfectly, because Corinna had a gift for always making herself the most beautiful person in any room, including rooms where she did not belong. "You're hunching again." "I'm not hunching. You are. It's a nervous habit. You've always had it." Corinna turned away before Maisie could respond, moving toward the vanity to adjust her own hair. "Your sister will be here in an hour. Try not to embarrass yourself before she arrives. Your sister," as if Isolde were the shared one, the beloved one, the one who belonged to the family by some deeper right than birth. Maisie pressed her molars together and looked at herself in the tall wardrobe mirror, 23 years old, dark-haired, unremarkable in a gown the color of old teeth, while somewhere down the corridor, her younger sister was being wrapped in actual white silk and rubbed with rose oil and told how extraordinary she was. The occasion was simple, as these things went in the Northern Territories. The Alpha King was traveling through Ashvale. He would stop. He would accept hospitality. He would dine at her father's table, and Lord Cedric Ashvale, who had 3 daughters and an estate drowning in unpaid debts, had decided months ago, quietly, carefully, with the same cold arithmetic he applied to everything, that this visit was an opportunity, that one of his daughters might catch the king's attention, that the right pairing could dissolve those debts overnight and return the Ashvale name to its former weight. He had not told Maisie this directly. He never told Maisie anything directly. She had overheard it, the way she overheard most of the important truths in her life, standing just past the door, breath shallow, learning things she wasn't meant to know. "Take the pretty one," he'd said. She had recognized Corinna's voice responding, low and agreeable. "Isolde. She photographs well in descriptions. If the king has heard of the Ashvale daughters at all, he'll have heard of her." Maisie had stood there for a moment with her hand flat against the cold stone wall, feeling something she didn't have a name for yet. Not quite surprise, because she hadn't been surprised in years, something older than surprise, something that had already been true for a long time, and had simply decided in that moment to stop pretending otherwise. She was not the pretty one. She had never been the pretty one. Isolde was golden and warm and laughed easily, and even when Maisie resented her, she couldn't hold it, because Isolde was also kind, genuinely kind, in the artless way of someone who had never needed to perform kindness for survival. The resentment never had anywhere to land. No, the feeling wasn't about Isolde. It was about her father saying, "Take the pretty one," the same way he might say, "Take the good horse" or "Take the Eastern Road." It was about being 23 years old and standing 2 doors away from the man who'd named her, and understanding, with absolute clarity, that she was furniture. She was the chair no one sat in. She would be present tonight because presence filled a room, and a room that looked full, looked generous. She smoothed her hands down the front of the ivory gown and looked at her own face in the mirror until it stopped feeling like her face. The great hall of Ashvale Manor smelled of pine resin and roasting meat, and the faint, underlying damp that no amount of hearth fire ever fully drove out of the old stones. Maisie stood near the second column, far enough from the entrance to be invisible, but close enough to satisfy the performance of being present. She had a goblet she wasn't drinking from. She had a smile she had been practicing since adolescence. Isolde arrived first from the family corridor, and Maisie watched her sister cross the room like weather moving through, all golden warmth and unconscious grace, her white dress catching the torchlight in a way that made Maisie's ivory look even worse by proximity. Isolde found her immediately. "You look lovely," Isolde said, reaching for her hand. "I look pale." "You look composed. There's a difference." Isolde squeezed once. "Father's in a state. The king's party arrived early." "How early?" "An hour." "They're already in the outer courtyard." Maisie felt something prickle at the back of her neck. Not nerves exactly, but a specific quality of attention that she'd always had and never fully understood. a sensitivity to wrongness, to the moment just before things shifted. She'd had it since childhood, this animal wariness, this sense of pressure before the storm was visible. It had never served her socially. Socially, it only made her seem withdrawn and watchful when everyone else was being warm. She set her goblet down on the column ledge and looked toward the entrance doors. They opened. The Alpha King's entourage entered in measured order. 6 guards in dark gray wool with silver at their collars, a traveling chancellor, 2 senior wolves who moved with the lazy, absolute confidence of men who had never once doubted their right to be anywhere. And then, behind them, the man himself. Maisie had expected ceremony. She had expected performance. He was neither. He was tall, not extraordinarily, but with a density of presence that made height irrelevant. Dark hair, cut short enough to look functional rather than styled. A gray traveling coat still carrying the dust of the road, which meant he hadn't stopped to dress for the occasion, which meant he either hadn't been informed of her father's expectations or hadn't cared about them. His face was composed in the way of someone who had learned to be still because stillness was power, not cold, not warm, simply present with a completeness that made everyone else in the room look slightly unfinished. His name was Reuben. Ruby, they called him in the territories, and she'd always thought that name absurd for a man like this, until she understood it. Not for softness, for hardness, for the particular quality of something that had been forged under extraordinary pressure until it became something that could not be broken. He didn't scan the room the way visiting nobility usually did, cataloging assets and faces with merchant's eyes. He simply entered it, let it be what it was. And then, for one moment that Maisie would return to many times in the weeks that followed, his gaze moved across the hall and stopped. Not on Isolde. On her. It lasted less than 2 seconds. Then he looked away, toward her father, and the formal greeting began, and Maisie stood very still beside her column with her empty goblet, and told herself she had imagined it. Dinner was 12 courses, which her father couldn't truly afford, and every plate arrived with the slightly desperate extravagance of a man trying to perform solvency. Maisie sat at the far end of the table, as she always did at formal occasions, close enough to count as present, far enough to be forgettable. Isolde sat 3 seats from the king, radiant and gracious, and Maisie watched her father watch the king, the way a man watches a contract he needs signed. She should have been watching the conversation. Instead, she was watching Corinna. Her stepmother was seated across the table, and 2 places left, close enough to the head that it communicated importance. She was being charming. Corinna was always charming in public. That was one of her gifts. But there was something in the angle of her attention tonight that sat wrong. She kept looking toward the far end of the hall, near the servants' entrance, with tiny, deliberate glances, not the glances of a woman surveying her staff. Something else. Maisie tracked her stepmother's gaze. A man she didn't recognize stood near the servants' door. Dark coat. Unremarkable face. The kind of unremarkable that was deliberate. Cultivated, Maisie thought. Practiced to be forgettable. He was looking at the wine steward. The wine steward was looking at the table, at the goblets. At which goblets? The prickling at the back of Maisie's neck became a cold flood down her spine. Her goblet was at the far end of the table. Her goblet was refilled less often, reached less easily, less watched. She looked at the dark wine in it and thought, quite clearly, quite calmly, the way her mind worked in moments of extreme clarity. That is not a coincidence. She thought about the debts. She thought about Take the Pretty One. She thought about what she was worth to her father when weighed against what he needed, and what she was worth to Corinna's calculations, and what she would be worth to neither of them the moment she became an obstacle to either. She didn't drink. She watched. And 20 minutes later, she watched the kitchen boy who'd stolen a sip from the wrong goblet during cleanup be carried out of the hall by 2 servants, convulsing, while her father's voice covered the commotion by laughing too loudly at something the king had said. Maisie set her hands flat on her thighs beneath the table. She was not going to make a sound. She was not going to cry or shake or shatter, not here, not in this hall, not where any crack in her composure would be managed and explained and turned against her. But she understood now, with the total silence of someone whose worst suspicion had just been confirmed, that the chair no one sat in had become the chair someone wanted removed entirely, and there was nowhere in this house that was safe. She did not sleep. She sat on the edge of her bed with her hands folded in her lap and listened to the manor settle into its nighttime sounds, the creak of old timber, the distant clank of the kitchen being cleared, the muffled conversation of guards rotating at the outer gate. And she thought with the methodical quietness of someone who understood that panic was a luxury she could not afford. The kitchen boy's name was Pell. He was 14. She had seen him carry wood to the upstairs hearths every winter morning since he was 9. She did not know yet if he was alive. She knew that the wine in her goblet had been meant for her. She knew that her stepmother had been watching the man in the dark coat, and the man in the dark coat had been watching the steward, and the steward had been watching the goblets with the careful attention of someone who had been told exactly which one mattered. The chain was short and clean. Corinna had not improvised this. This had been arranged in advance of tonight, which meant it had been arranged in advance of the king's visit, which meant her death had been planned as a quiet parallel event to her sister's presentation. 2 things happening at once, neither one drawing attention to the other. Why tonight, she thought. And then, almost immediately, because tonight there is a reason for a large gathering, and a large gathering means noise, and noise means a small incident can be contained. She thought about her father's debts. She thought about Corinna's patience over the years, the long, quiet patience of a woman who had been building toward something. She thought about what she stood to inherit under the estate's original terms, which her father had drafted before his second marriage and never formally revised, which gave the eldest daughter, Maisie, primary claim to the Asheville lands in the event of her father's death, before any portion could pass to a second wife. She was 23. Her father was not old, but he was not well. His lungs had been bad for 2 winters. Corinna was not patient. Corinna was strategic. Maisie looked at the cold hearth across from her bed and understood that she had been living inside a plan she hadn't known existed, and that the plan was almost complete, and that she had survived tonight only because a 14-year-old boy had been thirsty. She stood up. She did not have much time. Not. If the attempt had failed quietly, and it had, because no one had come to her door, because the commotion had been managed and muffled and the guests would have been told it was a kitchen accident, then Corinna would know, would recalculate, would not wait long before trying again with less ambiguity. Maisie moved to her wardrobe and dressed in the dark, by touch. A plain wool dress, deep gray, warm. Her riding boots, her heaviest cloak. She had 17 silver coins in a cloth pouch at the bottom of her second trunk. Money she had accumulated over years from small, unnoticed economies. Change from household errands she'd been trusted with. A bracelet she'd quietly sold 2 winters ago, when she understood that safety required resources, and no one was going to give her any. She took the pouch. She took the small knife she kept beneath her mattress, which she had never told anyone about. She did not take anything that would be missed immediately. She moved to her door and stood with her ear against the wood for a long count of 30. The corridor was quiet. She opened the door. The east servants' stair was the oldest part of the manor, built before the main structure, stone steps worn smooth in the center from generations of feet that the family had never bothered to count. Maisie had used it since childhood specifically because no one who mattered ever used it. She went down without a candle, one hand on the wall, counting steps by memory. She was on the 3rd landing when she heard the voices. She stopped. Below her, at the base of the stair, near the door that connected to the outer pantry. 2 voices, low, with the particular quality of people who believed themselves unobserved. Her father's voice, and Corinna's. Didn't work. Corinna, clipped, controlled, not distressed, simply adjusting. The boy is irrelevant. He's stable enough, they won't make a scene over a kitchen servant. A pause, the soft sound of fabric moving. We move the timeline. Corinna? Her father's voice had something in it she rarely heard. Not affection, but a specific kind of dependence. The voice of a man who had long ago let someone else make the important decisions and had forgotten how to take them back. If something were to happen, and it were traced, nothing will be traced. I've been careful for 3 years. Another pause. She's 23, Cedric. She's healthy. She could outlive you by 40 years, and when she does, she takes everything we've built. Everything I've managed. Everything Isolde should have. The last word carried the weight of genuine conviction. Corinna didn't hate Maisie abstractly. She hated her specifically, as an obstacle to something she'd already decided was rightfully hers. The king's interest in Isolde is already visible. If we can secure a betrothal before he leaves, he hasn't indicated interest. He looked at her, twice. For a man like that, that's indication enough. A soft exhale. But none of it matters if Maisie is standing in the inheritance line. You know that. You've always known that. Silence. Long enough that Maisie, on the dark stair, could hear her own blood in her ears. Then her father said, "Be quick about it." 3 words. No anguish. No hesitation. Maisie's hand was flat against the stone wall, and she felt the cold of it move through her palm and up her arm and settle somewhere in her chest, where she thought the last remaining softness toward him had lived. Some small, irrational warmth she'd kept despite everything, the part of her that had continued, absurdly, to want to be seen by him, and she felt it go quiet, not break. Go quiet, become something harder and more useful. She turned on the stair and went back up. The window at the end of the Upper East corridor looked out over the kitchen garden, which was enclosed on 3 sides by the manor's outer wall, but open on the 4th to the old orchard path. Maisie had known since she was 11 that the lock on that window was broken. She had broken it herself, deliberately, and never mentioned it, against exactly this kind of need. She opened it. Cold air came in, smelling of wet earth and the faint char of extinguished torches. She looked at the drop, 10 feet to the kitchen garden's soft ground, and sat on the sill and pushed herself off. She landed hard, one knee coming down in the mud, and stayed there for a moment with her hands in the cold earth, breathing. Then she stood and moved for the orchard path. She had no destination. That was the honest truth of it. She had coins and a knife and a cloak, and the fact that this house wanted her dead, and beyond the orchard wall was the road, and beyond the road was the question of where a woman alone at night went, when the only home she'd ever had just become the most dangerous place she knew. She was halfway through the orchard, the bare winter trees gray and skeletal in the cloud-covered moonlight, when she heard the sound ahead of her. Not footsteps. Something larger. Something that moved with too much silence for its size, which was a specific wrongness that she recognized at a cellular level. The way prey recognized predator not by thought, but by every nerve firing at once. She stopped. The shape ahead of her was massive. Low at the shoulder, broad through the chest, dark gray fur that disappeared at the edges into the night, yellow eyes that caught what little light existed and held it. A wolf, not a wild one. She knew the difference by instinct. A shifted wolf, enormous, standing completely still in the gap between 2 bare apple trees, and watching her with an intelligence that no animal possessed. She should have run. She understood that she should have run. Instead, she stood in the frozen mud of the orchard path and looked at those yellow eyes and felt, beneath the fear, something that made no coherent sense, a profound, cellular recognition. As though her body had encountered this specific quality of presence before, in some older memory she didn't have access to. Not attraction, not comfort. Something more fundamental than either. Like the feeling of a word on the tip of the tongue, except the word was safety. And she had never felt entirely safe in her entire life, and her body did not know what to do with the sensation. The wolf didn't move. Then slowly, with the deliberate control of something that wanted very much to communicate that it was choosing restraint, it stepped back. A step, then another. Then it turned, unhurried, unmistakably voluntary, and disappeared into the deeper shadow of the orchard trees, and the gap between the apple trees was empty. Maisie stood in the cold for a moment longer. Then she went through the gap and out toward the road, because she had nowhere else to go, and because the darkness in the direction the wolf had gone felt, inexplicably, less threatening than the lit windows of the house behind her. She did not look back. The manor's torchlight shrank at her back, and the cold road opened ahead, and she walked into it with mud on her boots, and her father's voice still sitting in her chest like a stone. Be quick about it. She kept walking. She did not let herself feel it yet. There would be time for feeling it later, when she was somewhere that she could afford to fall apart for a moment without dying for it. For now, there was only the road, and somewhere in the dark ahead, the soft sound of something large moving quietly through trees, keeping pace. The road from Ashvale ran north for 3 miles before it met the crossroads at Dunmer's Fork, where travelers could choose between the valley route toward the merchant towns or the Highland Pass that climbed into the territories governed directly by the king's seat. Maisie had ridden both roads years ago, when her father still occasionally allowed her to accompany the estate's trading parties. She knew the valley route was longer but warmer. She knew the Highland Pass was exposed and brutal in winter, but faster by 2 days. She walked north and tried not to think about how cold her feet were. The sound in the trees kept pace with her for almost a mile. She was aware of it the entire time. Not the crashing sound of something pursuing, but the soft, deliberate rhythm of something that was choosing to remain within a certain distance. She didn't call out. She didn't run. Running would reframe the situation in a way she wasn't prepared to survive, and besides, she had the obscure, irrational conviction that if the wolf had wanted to harm her, she would already be harmed. It had stepped back. Whatever that meant, it meant something. At the half-mile stone, the sound stopped. She walked another 100 yards before she allowed herself to glance sideways at the tree line. Empty. Bare branches and darkness, and the distant sound of wind moving through pine higher up the slope. She faced forward again, kept walking. She was so focused on her own footsteps that she didn't hear the horses until they were close, and by then, the torchlight was already visible ahead, coming from the direction of Dunmer's Fork, moving toward her. Multiple horses. 6, she thought, or 8, moving at a canter that slowed as the torches picked her out on the road. She stopped and assessed. A woman alone on a winter road at what was now well past midnight was not a safe thing to be in front of strangers. She measured the distance to the tree line. Too far. She put her hand inside her cloak and found the knife handle. "Hold," said a voice from the lead horse, not a shout, but the voice of someone accustomed to being heard without raising their volume. A controlled voice. The kind of voice that didn't need to perform authority because it simply had it. The horses stopped. The torchlight reached her, and she stood in it, and the man on the lead horse looked down at her for a long moment without speaking. It was the Alpha King. He had changed from his dinner clothes, riding coat, dark leather, functional, and his hair was slightly disarranged from speed, and he looked nothing like the composed, deliberate figure from the dinner table. He looked like a man who had left somewhere quickly and with purpose. His eyes in the torchlight were dark, and they moved over her with an efficiency that was not dismissive but clinical, assessing, she realized, not admiring, checking for injury. "You're Cedric Ashvale's daughter," he said. Not a question. "I am. The elder one." She noticed that he said elder, not older. She didn't know why that distinction registered, but it did. "Yes." He held her gaze for a moment, and she made herself hold it back, because looking away would mean something, and she was not prepared to mean anything right now except, "I am upright and moving, and I have not broken yet." "You're on a winter road at midnight," he said, "with no horse, no escort, and mud on your dress. I'm aware. Your father's house is a mile south. I'm aware of that too." Something shifted in his expression. The faintest compression at the corners of his mouth, not quite amusement, not quite its opposite. He looked at one of his guards, a brief glance that communicated something she couldn't read, and then back at her. "Were you followed?" The question surprised her, not its content, but its direction. He was not asking why she was alone. He was not asking where she was going. He was asking about the threat behind her, which meant he had already concluded that there was one, which meant he was several steps ahead of the conversation she'd thought they were having. She said carefully, "I don't know." "I do," he said. He looked at the tree line for a moment, then back at her. "There were 2 men on horses who left the estate's eastern gate approximately 10 minutes after you left through the orchard. They turned north on this road. They're 20 minutes behind you, at the pace they were riding when last observed." Maisie's grip on the knife tightened inside her cloak. Last observed by whom? He didn't answer that directly. Instead, he said, "You can stand on this road and meet them. Or you can come with us." "Where are you going?" "North." He let that sit for a moment, away from Ashvale. She looked at him. She looked at his 6 guards, all of them still, all of them watching her with the alert patience of men who did this kind of thing, stopped on winter roads for women in mud-stained dresses, without visible surprise, which told her something about who this man was and what kinds of situations followed him. She thought about her father's voice, "Be quick about it." She thought about the road behind her, and the 2 men on horses, and the knife in her hand, which was honest, but not sufficient. "I'm not getting on a horse with a man I don't know," she said. No, he agreed. You'll ride with Senna. He indicated the rider to his left. A woman, Maisie realized, in riding clothes and a guard's gray wool, dark-haired, with a face that communicated neither warmth nor coldness, but a simple, practical reliability. She's my head of personal security. If it reassures you, she's also the one who would be responsible for your safety in my company, which means harming you would be a professional failure for her specifically. Senna looked at Maisie with an expression that said, I have no opinion about this, but I will do my job. It was, somehow, the most reassuring thing Maisie had encountered all evening. She took her hand off the knife. She walked to Senna's horse. They rode for 2 hours without significant conversation, which suited Maisie entirely. She sat behind Senna and watched the road unspool ahead in the torchlight and let her mind work through the inventory of what she knew, what she needed, and what she was going to do. What she knew? Her stepmother had tried to kill her. Her father had given permission for a second attempt. 2 men were behind her on this road. She had 17 silver coins, a knife, and the clothes she was wearing. What she needed: distance, time, and information she didn't yet have about the full extent of the estate's legal structure, specifically whether Corinna had already taken steps to alter the inheritance terms before making her move, which would change the nature of what was possible. What she was going to do, she didn't know yet. That was the honest answer, and she had been raised by circumstances to be honest with herself even when she was performing calm for everyone else. She looked at the back of the Alpha King's head, ahead of her on the road, and thought about the fact that he had known about the men from the Eastern Gate, which meant he had something, watching the Ashvale estate's exterior during his own stay there, which meant he had not arrived at her father's table without precautions, which meant he was, at minimum, not naive. She thought about his eyes on her in the great hall, that 2-second pause that she'd told herself she'd imagined. She was not going to think about that. At the second hour, the road widened where it met the outer grounds of a way station, a stone building used by the king's traveling parties, she understood, one of several maintained at intervals along the Highland route. Warm light in the windows, the smell of wood smoke and horses. Inside, it was clean and well kept. A main room with a long table and a fireplace that was already burning, a corridor leading to sleeping quarters. Someone had been here ahead of the main party, preparing it. She stood near the fire and felt the warmth reach her cold hands and tried not to let the relief of it show on her face. The Alpha King came to stand a few feet from the fire, not beside her. A deliberate distance, she noted, close enough to speak, far enough to be unimposing. He had a cup of something, held loosely. You should eat, he said. There's bread and meat on the table. I'm not hungry. You're cold and you've been walking and you're running on fear, he said, without particular judgment. Eat anyway. She looked at him. You're very certain about things you have no information about. I have some information, he said. He turned to look at the fire, which gave her his profile, clean jaw, dark eyes, the faint line of an old scar at the edge of his left cheekbone. You left a dinner at which you were seated at the far end of the table in a color that didn't suit you, wearing an expression that people wear when they're performing composure rather than feeling it. You left through the kitchen garden at midnight. You took nothing with you that could be seen from outside a window, which means you packed before dinner, which means you knew before dinner that you might need to leave. He looked at her. That's not a woman fleeing an argument. That's a woman who discovered something specific and had the intelligence to prepare before she reacted. Maisie said nothing for a moment. Then, why were you watching me? The question came out more directly than she intended. She saw something move through his expression. Not evasion, not performance. Something quieter. Because you were the only person in that hall who was watching everyone else, he said. And in my experience, the person doing that is either the threat or the one who knows where it's coming from. She held his gaze. And which did you decide I was? I'm still deciding, he said, and the honesty of it was so unexpected that she almost laughed. A short, involuntary, almost sound that she pressed back down immediately. She went to the table and ate bread and cold meat standing up, with her cloak still on, because sitting felt like softening, and she was not ready to soften yet. Behind her, she heard him say quietly to Senna, "Double the watch. The 2 from Ashvale's Eastern Gate. If they come within a mile of this station, I want to know before they know we know." Senna's response was too low to hear. Maisie chewed her bread and stared at the table's wooden grain and thought about the word mate, which she had been very carefully not thinking about since the orchard, since the moment she had looked at those yellow eyes in the dark and felt that terrible, unwanted recognition. She thought about it now, briefly and clinically, the way she thought about dangerous things. Directly, without flinching, and then set it aside. She was not going to be anyone's anything right now. She was going to survive first. Everything else was a conversation for later, if later came. She finished the bread. She did not look at him again that night. She slept for 4 hours and woke before anyone else. The way station was quiet in the gray pre-dawn. The fire reduced to orange coals. The guards changed at some point in the night without her hearing it, which meant she had slept more deeply than she intended, and that fact unsettled her. She didn't sleep deeply in unfamiliar places. She barely slept deeply in familiar ones. She lay still for a moment on the narrow cot in the room Senna had shown her to, staring at the low ceiling, and ran through everything again with the methodical discipline she had developed over years of needing to understand her situation before anyone else in it woke up. She was in a King's Way station on the Highland Road. She had left her father's house with 17 coins and a knife. Her stepmother had tried to poison her. Her father had sanctioned a second attempt. 2 men had followed her north and had either been stopped by the King's Watch or were still out there, waiting for a better moment. She had no proof of any of it. That was the problem she kept returning to, the way a tongue returns to a broken tooth. She had seen the man in the dark coat. She had seen Corinna's glances. She had watched Pell be carried out of the hall. She had stood on a dark staircase and heard her father's voice say, "Be quick about it." None of that was proof. None of that was the kind of evidence that could be placed before a council and used to do anything. It was a collection of witnessed moments that could each be individually explained away by a woman as practiced as Corinna. She sat up, pulled her boots on, folded the blanket. In the main room, she found the fire rebuilt and Senna at the table with a cup of something steaming, reading a folded document with the focused attention of someone going through a routine morning task. Senna looked up when Maisie entered, assessed her in one glance, and nodded toward the fire where a pot was hanging. "Tea," Senna said, "and there's news." Maisie poured tea and sat across from her. The 2 men stopped at the mile marker at approximately 3 in the morning. Senna set the document down. "They were carrying a sealed letter with your father's crest, addressed to no one, which is not how legitimate correspondence works. Inside, a description of you, a physical description, and the phrase 'return her quietly.'" Senna's voice was neutral in the way of someone who had learned to deliver terrible information without editorializing. "They've been detained." Maisie held her cup in both hands and felt the warmth of it against her palms and thought, very precisely. So there is proof now, not of the poison, not yet, but of pursuit, of intent. A sealed letter with her father's crest instructing unknown men to return her quietly was not the action of a concerned parent. It was the action of someone trying to recover something they'd lost before it could speak to anyone. "Where is the king?" she asked. "He'll be in shortly. He runs in the mornings." Maisie looked at her. "He runs." "Shifted, northern perimeter. Every morning, regardless of where he is." Senna said it the way one describes the weather. Simple fact. No mythology attached. "He'll want to speak with you about the letter." "I'll want to speak with him about more than the letter." Senna looked at her for a moment with something that might, in a different face, have been the beginning of approval. "I thought you might," she said. He came in from the cold with the particular quality of someone who had just been something else entirely. Not disheveled, not visibly changed, but carrying a residual aliveness that indoor people didn't have. His hair was damp at the edges. He poured water from the ewer near the door over his hands, dried them, and sat across from her at the table without preamble. She had the letter in front of her. She had read it 3 times. "My father wrote this," she said. "His crest. His handwriting." She pushed it toward him. "I've been reading his handwriting since I was 7. The R in return. He always writes it with a secondary stroke at the base. It's him." She watched him read it. "It isn't evidence of the poisoning attempt, but it connects him to the pursuit. If the kitchen boy's condition can be documented by a physician who will testify—" "Pell," Reuben said. not looking up from the letter. "The boy's name is Pell. He's stable. My physician traveled with the household party. I had him attend the boy last night before we left, under the explanation that he'd been called in a professional capacity." Maisie went still. "You knew?" "I suspected." He set the letter down. "Something happened in that hall during dinner. The management of it was too smooth, which means it was practiced, which means it wasn't the first time." He looked at her directly. "I didn't know it was aimed at you specifically until you walked out into the orchard." She thought about the yellow eyes in the dark between the apple trees, the wolf that had stepped back. She thought about the fact that she had walked toward it rather than away, and had not, at any point, been able to entirely explain that decision to herself. She looked at him now, and said carefully, "That was you. In the orchard." He didn't look away. "Yes. You were watching the estate." "I was." No apology in it, no performance of guilt, simply the direct acknowledgement of a man who had done something and was prepared to own it clearly. "My chancellor received correspondence 3 weeks ago, suggesting that the Ashvale invitation was not straightforward, that there was a secondary purpose to the timing of it. I came prepared to observe. And what were you observing for?" "Initially, a political concern. Your father has debts to 2 merchant houses that are connected to a council faction I've been watching for 2 years. He said it evenly, as though discussing the weather, and she understood that this was how he processed everything, with a kind of unruffled clarity that was not coldness but precision. "When I saw you in that hall, I understood that the concern was not only political." She held his gaze. She was not going to ask what he meant by that. She was not ready for what he meant by that. Instead, she said, "I need 3 things. I need Pell's medical documentation. I need access to the original estate documents, the inheritance terms my father drafted before his second marriage. And I need to speak with my brother." A pause. "You have a brother. Half-brother. Edwin. He's been at the Northern Monastery School for 4 years. My father said it was for his education." She heard her own voice flatten slightly as she said the next part. "I've had 2 letters in 4 years, and neither one sounded like Edwin. They sounded like someone describing Edwin." She met his eyes. "I think he's been held there. I think Corinna arranged it so that when she moved against me, there would be no one left with any claim to dispute the estate's redirection." Reuben was quiet for a moment. The fire crackled. Outside, the wind moved against the way station's stone walls with a low, persistent sound. "The monastery at Grayfen," he said finally. "It was not a question. You know it. I know the man who administers it. He owes his position to a council appointment that came through channels I now understand better than I did 2 years ago." Something moved through his expression. Not anger, but the particular quality of a man adding information to a picture that was already large and getting larger. "I can have riders there by nightfall." She looked at him. She was waiting for the condition. For the thing he would want in exchange, because that was how these transactions worked. She had grown up watching her father negotiate, watching Corinna negotiate, watching every resource offered with a hand that expected a return grip. He didn't offer a condition. He simply said, "I'll send them this morning." "Why?" she asked, and the directness of it surprised even her. The rawness of the single word, the genuine inability to accept generosity at face value. "Why are you doing any of this?" He looked at her for a long moment. She had the sense that he was choosing words with the same care she used, and that this was rare for him, that he was usually sparing with explanation. "Because what was done to you in that house was wrong," he said. "And because I have the resources to address it. And because—" A brief pause. The only one she had seen from him, a single moment of something that was almost hesitation. "I have a reason to want you safe that goes beyond the political." He held her gaze. "I'm not going to explain that further right now, because you don't trust me yet, and I'm not going to ask you to, but I want you to know it exists." She felt the thing again, that deep, unwanted cellular recognition, that terrible, almost feeling that she had been pushing down since the orchard. She pushed it down again, harder. "I don't trust anyone right now," she said. "I know." He stood, and the conversation closed with the naturalness of a man who understood when to stop pressing. "That's reasonable. Trust what I do, not what I say. That's all I'm asking." They left the way station at mid-morning, and the next 4 days were motion and cold, and a gradual, reluctant recalibration of everything Maisie thought she understood about what safety felt like. It felt like this, apparently. Senna riding beside her and explaining, without being asked, the layout and protocol of the king's seat at Vorheim. The guards rotating around the party with the calm efficiency of people who did their jobs well and without drama. Meals at way stations where she was given food without being told she should be grateful for it. A spare room prepared each night with clean linen and a fire already burning. And Reuben, who was present without being suffocating, who spoke to her in the evenings about practical things, the legal channels available for contesting estate tampering, the physician's documented notes on Pell's condition and what they confirmed, the progress of the writers sent north toward Grayfen, and who never once pushed past the line she kept drawing around herself, who noticed when she was tired before she admitted it, who, on the third evening, without explanation, left a book on the table near her chair, a volume on inheritance law as practiced in the Northern Territories, and said nothing about it, and was already in conversation with his chancellor when she picked it up. She read it for 2 hours. She was beginning, against every reasonable instinct, to map the shape of him. He was not performing patience. She knew the performance of patience. Her father had performed it when he needed something. Corinna had performed it for 3 years while building a plan to end her life. This was different. This was a man who had simply decided that she was worth waiting for, and had made peace with that decision, and was now living inside it without visible strain. It undid her slightly, more than she wanted it to. On the 4th morning, she woke to Senna's voice outside her door, low, urgent, and was dressed and out before the full sentence finished, and found the main room tense with the kind of specific stillness that meant news had arrived. Reuben was standing at the table with a letter. He looked up when she came in, and something in his expression shifted in a way she was beginning to recognize. A softening that was not weakness, a care that he didn't perform. The riders reached Grayfen, he said. Her hands went still at her sides. And Edwin is alive. He paused. He's been kept there under a documented arrangement between the monastery administrator and a factor employed by your stepmother. He was told, repeatedly, over 4 years, that you had died, that there was nothing to return to. The room was very quiet. Maisie stood in it and breathed through her nose and kept her face still, because she had learned to do that, and because the alternative was to come apart entirely, and she was not going to do that here. But Reuben crossed the room in 3 steps and held out the letter, her brother's handwriting. She saw immediately, the looping D she would have known anywhere. And when her hand shook slightly as she took it, he didn't mention it. He simply stood close enough that she could feel the warmth of him at her side, and said nothing and let her read. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and held it against her chest and stared at the fire, and let herself feel 1 minute of the thing she had been keeping locked, the grief, the fury, the 4 years of letters that hadn't sounded like Edwin, because they hadn't been from Edwin. The waste of it, the cruelty of it, the specific wickedness of telling a boy his sister was dead. 1 minute. She counted it. Then she looked up and said, with a steadiness that cost her something, I want to go to Vorheim. I want to use every legal channel available. I want Corinna and my father to answer for this publicly, in front of a council that cannot be managed or muffled, and I want my brother brought to me safely. Reuben looked at her with those dark, steady eyes. Then that, he said, is exactly what we'll do. Vorheim was nothing like Ashville. Where her father's manor had been old stone and managed decay, rooms kept dim to hide what couldn't be afforded, Vorheim was a working seat of power, vast and unapologetic, built into the northern rock face like something that had grown there rather than been constructed. The great hall had ceilings that disappeared into shadow, and hearths wide enough to stand in, and the corridors smelled of pine resin and leather, and the cold, clean air that came off the mountains, and never quite left, even indoors. It was a place that did not perform its importance. It simply had it. Maisie arrived with mud still on her second-best boots, and Senna at her shoulder, and the letter from Edwin folded inside her cloak against her ribs, and she walked through Vorheim's main gate, with her spine straight and her face composed, and felt, for the first time in her adult life, that she was somewhere that would not require her to make herself smaller in order to survive. She did not let herself feel that too deeply. She had learned the danger of feeling safe too soon. The council hearing was set for 12 days after her arrival, which gave Reuben's legal chancellor time to assemble the documentation and gave Maisie time to prepare her testimony with a precision she approached like a problem to be solved rather than a wound to be reopened. She worked every morning at the long table in the chamber Senna had arranged for her, building the case layer by layer. Pell's medical documentation, signed by 2 physicians now. The sealed letter with her father's handwriting and crest. Written testimony from 2 of the Ashvale household staff who had been quietly contacted through channels that bypassed the estate entirely and had, it turned out, been waiting years for someone to ask, and the documented arrangement discovered at Grafin, which connected the monastery administrator directly to Corinna's personal factor and included 4 years of payment records. Edwin arrived on the 7th day. She heard him before she saw him, his voice in the corridor outside, asking someone a question with the particular directness she remembered, unchanged by 4 years of forced isolation. And she was at the door before she consciously decided to move, and then he was there, taller than she remembered, thinner, with new lines around his eyes that shouldn't have been there yet at 19, and she held him for a long moment in the doorway, without saying anything because there was nothing adequate to say. He held on with both arms and didn't let go first. When they finally separated and looked at each other, his eyes were wet and his jaw was set in the way of someone refusing to cry in a corridor, and she understood that 4 years of being told she was dead had done something to him that would take longer than a week to undo. "She told me there was a fever," he said. "Corinna. She wrote that you'd been ill and then that you were gone." She described the grave. "There is no grave." "I know that now." He looked at her with something fierce and specific in his face. "I want her to answer for it." "She will," Maisie said. "I promise you she will." Reuben came to find her on the 9th evening. She was in the Eastern Library, a room she had discovered on her 3rd day, and returned to every evening since, drawn by the combination of firelight and the particular quality of silence that only old books produced. She was not reading. She was sitting with a cup of cold tea and looking at the fire and letting herself feel, quietly and in private, the accumulated weight of the past 2 weeks. He knocked on the open door before entering, which she had noticed he always did. This specific courtesy, this refusal to simply arrive in spaces she occupied, that should have been unremarkable, and somehow wasn't. "The Chancellor finished the final brief this evening," he said. "We're ready, I know." She looked at the fire. "I read it this afternoon." He came into the room and sat in the chair across from hers, not beside her, the deliberate distance she had come to recognize as his way of asking permission through proximity rather than words. He had a small glass of dark liquid, held loosely. They sat in silence for a moment that was not uncomfortable. "After the hearing," she said finally, "whatever the outcome, I want to rebuild the Ashvale estate's legitimate management. The debts can be addressed through the inheritance claim. If the council finds in my favor, the estate reverts to my direct control. I want Edwin to have a role in it, a real one." "That's possible," he said. "Straightforward, legally, given the documentation." "I know. I've read the inheritance statutes." A pause. "Twice." She heard him exhale. Not quite a laugh, but the shape of one. Quiet and genuine. She felt it in her chest in a way she didn't examine directly. "Maisie." He said her name simply, without preamble, and she looked at him. He was watching the fire, and in the firelight, he looked like a man choosing words for the 2nd time in her experience. With care, with the specific gravity of someone who understood that some things, once said, changed the architecture of everything that followed. "I want to tell you something, and I want to be clear that I'm not telling you because I expect anything in return. I'm telling you because I think you deserve honesty more than you've been given. And I've been deciding for 2 weeks whether the timing was right." She kept her face still. Her heart was not still. "I knew who you were before Ashvale," he said. "Not personally. By the pull." He looked at her then, directly, with no performance in it. "I've known for 6 months that my mate was somewhere in the Northern Territories. I didn't know a name. I didn't know a face. I knew a direction and a quality of certainty that I've never felt about anything else in my life, and I followed it, and it led me to your father's table." A pause. "And then to you, specifically, in the exact moment you were in the most danger you'd ever been in, which is not the meeting I would have chosen, if I'd had a choice about it." Maisie looked at the fire. She let herself feel the full weight of what he'd said. Not flinch from it, not immediately construct a defense against it. Just feel it as the true thing it was. She thought about the orchard, about the moment she had looked at those yellow eyes and felt something she'd never felt before, and had spent 2 weeks refusing to name. She thought about the word mate and all the pain she had attached to the world it came from, the world that had poisoned her wine and sent men after her on a winter road and locked her brother in a monastery for 4 years. She thought about how easy it would be to use that pain as a reason to refuse everything, to keep refusing, to make herself unreachable as a form of self-protection. She thought about what it would cost her. "I'm not ready," she said. Her voice was steady. "I need you to know that. Whatever the bond is, whatever you feel, I'm not ready to feel it fully yet. I have too many open things. I need to see this through." "I know," he said without hesitation. "I'm not asking you to be ready. I'm asking you to know. There's a difference," she said. "There's a significant difference." He looked at the fire again. "I'm not going anywhere. I'm not pressing. I'm not going to make your choices for you or confuse protecting you with owning you. I want you to know what I feel because you deserve the truth, not because I need you to act on it." She looked at him in the firelight for a long moment. Then she said, "The wolf in the orchard stepped back." "Yes." "That was deliberate." "Yes." "Why?" He looked at her. "Because you were already afraid, and I wanted you to know that whatever I wasn't one more thing you needed to run from." The fire shifted. A log settled, throwing a brief flare of warmth across the room. Maisie looked at him and felt the last guard on her chest. Not fall, not break, but ease slightly, the way ice eases at the very beginning of a thaw, which is not the same as melting, but is the beginning of the same journey. She said, "After the hearing." He understood what she meant. She could see it in his face, the acknowledgement of a promise, the acceptance of its terms. "After the hearing," he agreed. The council chamber at Vorheim held 43 representatives from the Northern and Central Territories, and Maisie stood before them on the 12th morning and spoke for nearly an hour. She did not perform distress. She did not ask for sympathy. She presented the documentation in order, layer by layer, the same way she had built it, with precision, with the cold clarity of someone who had been quiet for 23 years and had decided that this was the last time she would be quiet about something that mattered. Her father sat across the chamber with a council-appointed advocate and the specific gray look of a man watching a consequence arrive that he had convinced himself would never come. Corinna was not present. She had been detained at Asheville 2 days prior, following a separate testimony from the household staff, and was facing a distinct proceeding regarding the deliberate poisoning. Maisie did not look at her father when she spoke. She had decided, in the Eastern Library the night before, that she was not going to give him the dignity of her attention. He had spent 23 years not looking at her clearly. She could return the favor. The council found in her favor before midday. The Asheville estate reverted to her legal control. The inheritance terms her father had drafted before his second marriage were upheld in their original form. The debts, assessed against the estate's legitimate value, were manageable over time, a restructured arrangement that the chancellor had already drafted. Corinna's trial was a separate matter, scheduled for the following month, and the evidence was not circumstantial. Her father was stripped of his lordship title pending a conduct review. He left the chamber looking smaller than she had ever seen him, which she thought she would feel something specific about. Grief, satisfaction, some clean emotion with a defined edge. She felt mostly tired, the kind of tired that came after very long effort. When the effort was finally done, Edwin found her in the corridor outside the chamber and took her hand without speaking. She held it, and they stood there together for a moment, not saying anything, because some things didn't need words, and they had both learned that the hard way. She went to find Reuben. He was in the outer courtyard. She had learned his patterns, the way she learned everything, by watching, standing near the wall with his chancellor, reviewing something in a document, and he looked up when she crossed the courtyard toward him with an expression that was careful and warm, and asking nothing. She stopped in front of him and looked at him in the winter light. She thought about the 18 words he had said in the library that had rearranged something fundamental in her. "I want you to know that whatever I wasn't one more thing you needed to run from." She thought about 4 days on a winter road when he had given her information, resources, Riders North, a book on inheritance law, and had never once asked for anything in return. She thought about every moment he had been present without suffocating, protective without owning, steady without demanding that she soften. She thought about the mate bond, which she had been thinking about with increasing frequency and decreasing resistance for 12 days, and which she understood now. Not as a trap, not as a repetition of everything she'd survived, but as something she was choosing with full knowledge of what she was choosing. She reached up and put her hand against the side of his face. He went completely still under her touch, the way something goes still when it is being careful with itself. "The hearing is over," she said. He looked at her with those dark, steady eyes and said nothing, because he understood her, and because he knew this was hers to say. "I know what I feel," she said. "I've known for longer than I wanted to admit. I just needed everything else to be finished first, so I could be sure it was real and not fear wearing a different shape." His hand came up and covered hers, where it rested against his face. The warmth of it moved through her entirely. "Is it real?" he asked quietly. "It's the realest thing I've felt in my life," she said, "and that terrifies me slightly, so I thought you should know." Something moved through his expression. Relief, she thought, and joy, and the specific quality of a man who had been patient for a very long time and was now being given the thing he had waited for with grace rather than expectation. He lowered his head until his forehead rested against hers, and they stood like that in the cold courtyard, and she felt the bond settle between them like something that had been held at tension finally allowed to rest. "I have 17 silver coins," she said into the small space between them, "a knife, and a legal claim to an estate with restructured debts. I'm not precisely what anyone would call an advantageous match." She felt his exhale against her face. That quiet, genuine almost laugh that she had collected and stored without meaning to. "I'm the Alpha King," he said. "I'll manage." In the months that followed, Corinna was found guilty at trial on 2 charges, conspiracy to commit harm and unlawful detention of a minor, and sentenced to exile from the Northern Territories with her assets held in trust against the Ashvale estate's debt recovery. It was not a soft sentence, but it was a legal one, applied without theater, which was the kind of justice Maisie had wanted. Clean, documented, unambiguous. The kind that couldn't be explained away. Her father lived out the remainder of his years, 3 more winters, in a modest house on the estate's western edge, stripped of his title and his authority, attended by 2 servants and a physician. Maisie did not hate him, in the end. She had decided, sometime in the spring of that first year, that hatred was a sustained cost she wasn't willing to pay for someone who had already taken enough from her. She did not forgive him either. She simply closed that door carefully, from the outside, and did not open it again. Edwin became the Ashvale estate's managing steward, a role he took with the fierce, particular dedication of someone who understood what it had cost to reclaim it. He was good at it. He was good at most things when given the chance to actually try them, which 4 years of Greyfen had delayed but not destroyed. He visited Vorheim twice a year, and argued cheerfully with Reuben's chancellor about trade routes, and drove everyone slightly mad, and was, in every way that mattered, exactly himself. Pell, the kitchen boy, recovered fully. He was offered a position in Vorheim's household staff the following year, an offer made quietly, without ceremony, because some acts of repair didn't require an audience. And Maisie, who had stood on a winter road at midnight with 17 coins and a knife and nowhere to go, who had learned silence as a survival strategy and watching as a substitute for feeling safe. Maisie became Luna of the Northern Territories in the first thaw of that year, in a ceremony that was witnessed by 43 council representatives and 1 younger brother who cried without apology in the front row and was not teased for it, at least not until afterward. She wore white this time, not ivory. Not a color chosen to make her look sallow in torchlight by someone who had catalogued her as furniture. White, because she had chosen it herself, and because it was the right color, and because no one in that hall had any interest in making her look like anything other than exactly what she was. Reuben looked at her the way he had looked at her from the beginning, with the clear, complete attention of someone who had looked once and decided, and then had the patience to wait for her to decide too. She had decided. She was decided. The chair no one sat in had become, in the end, the seat at the head of the table, and she had not arrived there by being chosen. She had arrived there by surviving everything designed to stop her, by learning the difference between a man who used the word mate as a synonym for mine and a man who understood that it meant chosen, and by choosing, finally, with full knowledge and clear eyes, to let something good be true. The winter outside Vorheim's great hall was deep and still and cold. Inside, the fire was burning,